Geoffrey and the Vanishing Vile Velvet Trousers. Geoffrey Scratton was a small boy who lived in a big old house that sat in the middle of a beautiful green park filled with trees of every shape and size. Now, obviously, a small boy could not live alone, and he shared this very grand house with his father, mother, one brother Humphrey, and 4 sisters, Dorothy, Peggy, Muriel, and Barbara, who was the youngest and cheekiest of the Scratton children. The family also shared their home with numerous pets, including cats, dogs, rabbits, a horse, a crow, a parrot, and a peacock. And the animals got on surprisingly well, so long as they all respected each other's space and minded their manners at dinner time. The dogs, Mrs. Nan and her son Binks, were a pair of small scruffy hounds of no specific breed, but of great wit and intelligence, both sporting magnificent curly tails that they held high as they strutted around the grounds on their short stocky legs. Leopold the parrot lived in the parlour of the house, in a large fancy bird cage, and was let out for his daily exercise each day at 12 o'clock on the dot, when he was guaranteed to cause chaos as he stretched his wings and flapped around the rooms, terrifying the cook, knocking over ornaments, and often going to the toilet on the furniture and down the curtains. Outside in the walled garden where the family grew their fruit and vegetables lived the rabbit family, who were Mr. Buckles and his 2 wives, who spent most of their time chasing around after their many children. Living next to the rabbits in the walled garden was Prince Parvo III of Prittlewell, an incredibly grand peacock who loved to show off his magnificent tail of bright blue, gold and green feathers, in a display of grandeur suited to his noble ancestry, or that's what he thought at least. And last, but by no means least, there was Mr. Bilham, a large black crow who had been adopted by the Scratton children when he fell from his nest, and according to Geoffrey, had the shiniest feathers he had ever seen. As you can imagine, with a household this big and this busy, life was never dull for Geoffrey and his siblings, and they spent many hours playing in the park with their animals and writing stories about their adventures. Geoffrey loved to be outside and was happiest when he was in the park, getting muddy with his brother Humphrey. His sisters, however, preferred to write and paint, plus a particularly favourite hobby of sewing, and much to their brother's annoyance, the girls would use them as models for their latest creations, regardless of whether they were stylish or indeed fitted them properly. They once made poor Humphrey an enormous white flannel shirt, with sleeves so incredibly long that he tied himself in a knot trying to put it on, and was dizzy for an entire day after he had to be spun around several times to get out of it. Then there was the hat they made for Geoffrey, using scraps of brown wool fabric and crafted into what they told him was the latest style of circular headgear, but which in Geoffrey's opinion resembled a large sloppy cow hat. He managed to lose the hat in the park when out for a walk, and it was eventually chewed up and buried by a fox. One afternoon, as Geoffrey and Humphrey were outside playing with the dogs, Muriel came dashing out in a state of great excitement and announced that the latest House of Scratton fashion creation was to be a pair of trousers for Geoffrey, which wouldn't have concerned him too much if she hadn't followed this announcement by telling him, rather too gleefully he thought, that they were to be of bright red velvet, cut to the knee and adorned with row upon row of silver buttons. Geoffrey was speechless. Humphrey, who had been quietly trying to hide himself amongst the wisteria that grew over the front of the house, breathed a huge sigh of relief and skulked off to play in the woodshed before his sisters could pick on him, and even the dogs could sense that this wasn't going to end well for Geoffrey. Over the next few days, the girls measured, snipped and stitched until the trousers were complete, and Geoffrey dreaded the moment he'd have to try them on, for fear of an even worse garment being created next, should he refuse to wear this latest monstrosity. His fears were confirmed when he sneaked a quick peek through the parlour window, and laid out across a stool were the worst pair of trousers Geoffrey had ever seen. Apart from the fact that they were as red as a postbox, with ridiculously big silver buttons along each side, they looked very tight, and for a boy who liked to run and jump, and with his long legs could climb the stairs in the hallway 4 at a time, and he had signed witness accounts to prove it, this was most concerning. Mrs. Nan, who had followed behind Geoffrey as he crept up to the parlour window, sat beside him, her usually upright and curly tail now drooping in sympathy at poor Geoffrey's predicament. She wondered how she could help, as they really were the vilest pair of trousers she had ever seen. "Oh, Mrs. Nan," sighed Geoffrey as he ran his hand through her warm, scruffy fur. "I wish I could make those awful trousers just disappear, and I wish you could help me. But you're just a dog, aren't you, old girl?" And with this, he gave her a final quick pat on the head, heaved a large sigh, and walked off into the park to kick some leaves. "Well, young Geoffrey," Mrs. Nan thought to herself, "perhaps there is something I can do, but I'm going to need some help." And without further ado, she trotted off to hatch a plan with the other animals. After leaving the house and thinking about how on earth she was going to manage this grand plan of hers to make the terrible trousers disappear, Mrs. Nan finally arrived at the walled garden, where the other animals were gathered. Now, planning any kind of strategy with a group that included numerous cats and countless rabbits was quite a challenge for a small dog, as she very soon realised. But they all loved Geoffrey very much, and so wanted to help where they could. "We need a distraction," said Mrs. Nan. "Something that will take the family away from the parlour, and us dogs will then go in and steal the trousers." She went on to explain her cunning plan to the others, which they all thought sounded perfect, and only someone as clever as Mrs. Nan could have come up with it. She lowered her head and said such phrases as, "Oh my, stop that, you're making me blush to the tip of my tail." But secretly she was very chuffed indeed. But Mrs. Nan, ventured the smallest of the rabbit children quietly, "where will you hide the trousers?" "Oh, don't you worry about that, my dear," said Mrs. Nan with a wink. "I know exactly where to hide them. That will be both out of sight, yet under everyone's noses." And leaving the other animals looking very puzzled, she dashed off to have a chat with Leopold the parrot. She found Leopold in his usual place in the parlour, sitting on top of his large, fancy birdcage, preening his vibrant green feathers and looking very pleased with himself. "I thought you got let out of that cage once a day," she said. And Leopold lifted his head, stretched out one leg, opened his curved beak as wide as it would go, and let out an ear-shattering laugh. "What's so funny?" asked Mrs. Nan sharply, quite indignant at the parrot's rudeness. "What's so funny? You're so funny! That's what's so funny!" the parrot replied. And Mrs. Nan gave him one of her hardest stares, which usually worked very well on her son Binks, but had no effect on this tiresome bird. "What's wrong with your eyeballs?" he squawked. And before she could answer, he was off again. "Those silly human people don't know that I can open the door on this silly cage, so I let myself out. Clever, aren't I?" Thought Mrs. Nan. Not so clever that they always catch you and put you back in, but she felt it best to keep that thought to herself. "Now listen here, Leopold," she said. "As you are obviously such a clever fellow, you are perfect to lead our quest to save poor young Geoffrey from the fate of wearing those horrible trousers you see lying there waiting for him on that stool." Leopold, as well as being loud, was a bird that was easily flattered, and so agreed immediately to Mrs. Nan's plan for the trousers, even though she hadn't yet told him anything about it, and he didn't think the trousers were that bad really, and would certainly be happy to use them to line the bottom of his birdcage. "Oh dear," thought Mrs. Nan, "this is going to be a long afternoon." And she went on to explain to Leopold several times, to make sure it sank into his small bird brain, the plot to make the vile velvet trousers disappear. At the end of the day, as she finally snuggled down onto her cushion by the conservatory door, she wondered if this really was such a good idea after all. But the thought of Geoffrey's happy, smiling face when he realised the trousers were gone steadied her nerves, and with a big yawn, settled down to sleep. The next morning, the entire household was rudely awakened to a commotion going on downstairs, with Leopold's loud squawking shattering the silence. "Rabbits in the kitchen, rabbits in the hall, rabbits in the pantry, go and catch them all!" he repeated over and over, getting louder and louder, whilst the family scrambled bleary-eyed out of bed, grabbing what clothing they could, got dressed and ran downstairs to see what on earth was going on. The sight that met them was of utter chaos. The housekeeper had come in first thing, accompanied by the cook, and was swiftly followed through the door by Mr. Buckles the rabbit, his wives, and all their children, who'd earlier been let out of the walled garden by Mr. Billum the crow, and had hidden themselves in the undergrowth by the front door. The rabbits began to run this way and that, hopping down into the kitchen, hotly pursued by the cook, leaping around the hallway and heading toward the large sitting room at the back of the house, all the time taking the human occupants as far away from the parlour as possible. Leopold, as planned, had escaped from his cage to add to the confusion by flapping up the stairs to the bedrooms, where the faint cries of "Leopold, don't you dare! That's my best hat! Oh, you bad parrot!" could be heard, followed by squawks and the clattering of knickknacks being knocked off a dressing table and onto the wooden floor. Whilst all this hullabaloo was going on elsewhere in the house, Mrs. Nan slipped unnoticed into the parlour and grabbed the trousers with her teeth, whilst Binks stood guard outside, ready to give a warning bark should any of the family come their way. Well, of course, they didn't, as they were too busy trying to catch the parrot and round up all the rabbits. Plus, as an unexpected bonus, one of the cats decided to be sick over Mr. Scratton's favourite rug in the study, so Mrs. Nan was able to scoot out of the front door, trailing the trousers behind her. After what seemed like an age, the Scrattons managed to catch all the rabbits, put them in a big tin bath, and carried them back to the safety of the walled garden. They were completely puzzled as to how they'd escaped in the first place, and walked back to the house, each blaming the other for not closing the gate properly the day before. They had, of course, shut the gate perfectly well. It's just that they could never have guessed that Mr. Billum the crow was also very good at lifting the latch on the gate and getting it open. There had been so much excitement that morning, the girls almost forgot that they were going to present Geoffrey with his new trousers that very afternoon, and would of course expect him to wear them at every family occasion for at least the next 5 years. Walking back from the garden, Geoffrey trailed behind the others, dragging his feet, and as he approached the house, preparing to face his fate, he heard raised voices coming from inside the parlour. "Well, it can't be escaped rabbits again," he thought as he started to walk a little faster. By the time he arrived at the house, his sisters were all speaking at once in chattering, high-pitched tones that made them sound like a flock of sparrows at the bird table arguing over crumbs. Muriel came dashing out of the house, red-faced and pointing a finger at Geoffrey. "What have you done with them?" she cried. "What have I done with what?" replied Geoffrey indignantly. "You know perfectly well what, Geoffrey. The trousers, they're gone, nowhere to be seen, so what have you done with them?" Secretly, Geoffrey was delighted to hear this news and wanted to jump for joy, but he didn't show it for fear that he would indeed look guilty of a crime he hadn't actually committed, but sincerely wanted to shake the hand of whoever had stolen those vulgar trousers. The Scratton sisters hunted high and low for the trousers over the next few days, and they never did quite believe that Geoffrey didn't have a hand in their disappearance. But the days became weeks, and they eventually lost interest and moved on to their next fabulous creation. And as for the trousers, well, Mrs. Nan lived up to her word that they would be hidden in plain sight, as she knew there was one particular creature who loved nothing more than to put on a colourful display, but that the family only ever really looked at from the front as he paraded his magnificent tail of blue, gold and green feathers. They always thought he looked rather plain and dull from behind. So in your travels, if you ever come across a peacock showing off its spectacular feathers, don't forget to check the other side of its tail, as it might just be wearing a pair of bright red velvet trousers.